Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in to session 219 of the Behavioral Observations podcast. I'm really excited to bring back Dr. Greg Hanley to the show. As many of you know, he's been on the show a number of times, and we always have fun conversations, usually centering around the assessment and treatment of severe problem behavior as well as other things, and this show is no exception. We get right into the weeds of the practical functional assessment and skills-based treatment process straight away. So if you have nuanc-ey or detailed questions about how this process works, this is the show for you. We really get into the nitty-gritty. In this segment of the show, we discuss the changes his company, FTF, had to roll with over the last few years, what he and his colleagues are up to now. We spend a considerable amount of time discussing what they've learned about functional assessment and treatment and how their process has evolved over the years, especially in terms of the types of individuals who benefit from these interventions, as well as those who do not. Perhaps my favorite part of the conversation was when we discussed the complex nature of skills-based treatment. To this end, Greg talked about the kind of training one ideally needs to be able to implement SBT successfully. Long story short, it's a lot more than teaching someone to say my way. And speaking of training, FTF has a number of training opportunities available. They've got on-demand virtual trainings, in-person live workshops, short and long-term consultation engagements, and lots more. You can check the show notes of this episode out to get links to those resources. Greg also mentioned numerous studies, and instead of linking every single study, I linked to the publications page of their free website, practicalfunctionalassessment.com. If there are studies that he mentions that aren't on that page, let me know, and I will put them in the show notes. I'll update the show notes of this episode, which, again, you can find at behavioralobservations.com. All right, back to the interview itself. We also talk, one of the things we didn't get into, but I want to make mention of, is that FTF is making this process applicable and accessible by public schools. So if you want to learn more about that, I've got a link to a short video that they've produced on that. We also didn't get a chance to get into the SBT data collection app that the folks at Hi Erasmus have created, but I've got links to that as well. You can check that out. And so there's a lot, again, many resources we talked about in the show are available over at behavioralobservations.com. I should also note that if you want the show notes to any of these episodes delivered straight to your email inbox, you can just sign up for the email list on the website. It's really easy to do, and you can get the show notes delivered via email, which is a lot more convenient. All right, back to the interview, because there's a whole second half of the interview that's just fantastic. After this kind of lengthy nuts and bolts discussion of what makes for successful SBT interventions, we broadened the lens to discuss many of the so-called hot topics in behavior analysis these days. This included the influence of social media groups, overly rigid rule adherence, in which we spend a fair bit of time talking about token systems. That's a really interesting part of the conversation. We talked about Greg's perspective on trauma-informed and trauma-assumed ABA. We talk about other aspects of what I'm referring to as hyphenated ABA that are being discussed. We talk about practical perspectives on assent. And if you're like me and often think about the limitations of assent-based models of treatment, this will be especially helpful. And by the way, I've linked this article by my colleague, Dr. Polly Gavoni and Steve Ward, that they've just written on this topic as well. You can check that out in the show notes too. And we certainly talk about extinction, when it is and isn't applicable, and what that looks like in this process. Greg also opened up a bit about how he almost left the field of ABA. Yeah, you heard that correctly. You'll have to listen to the show to hear this in his own words. It's a really interesting aspect of the conversation. Greg was extremely generous with his time, and he actually stuck around to answer many questions from Patreon members. As you might imagine, there were lots of great questions, and the answers were punctuated with a few really funny stories that you don't want to miss. So all of this to say and more, I really enjoyed this conversation. I think this is one of my favorite interviews with Greg. It's certainly one of my favorite interviews, period, that I've done for this podcast. So I hope you enjoy it as much as I have. Before we get to the show, I want to spend a minute thanking our sponsors. This show is brought to you by How to ABA. Their goal is to make you feel supported and confident when helping your clients make real progress In their membership community, you'll find all the assessments, programs, data sheets, and materials you need so that your job is just a little bit easier. As a member, you'll also be invited each month to join a live CEU and live mentorship session in their private community group. You'll also have access to their extensive CEU library of recorded on-demand CEUs, all on relevant practical topics to BCBAs in the field. So go to howtoaba.com/join. And when you join today, use code BOP to save 10% off your yearly subscription. We're also brought to you by Behavior University. Their mission is to provide university-quality professional development for the busy behavior analyst. Learn about their CEU offerings, including their brand new 8-hour supervision course, as well as their RBT offerings over at behavioruniversity.com/observations. We're also brought to you by the Verbal Behavior Conference. It's taking place March 30th and 31st in none other than Austin, Texas. If you can't make it to Austin, it's also available virtually, and I believe it's also available on demand after the event. So if you're listening to this show and it's past the event itself, just still check out the links in the show notes to the Verbal Behavior Conference. There's lots of great talks, and my understanding is that you can access those after the fact as well. It's going to be 2 days of lots of fun conversation, digging really into the details of all things verbal behavior. I attended it last year. It's great fun. There's lots of opportunities for personal interactions with the speakers, and even in the virtual option, Behavior Live has done a really nice job just nailing the virtual conference experience. So I hope to see you there, whether in person or virtually. You can check out, again, the links to that in the show notes of this episode. You can certainly just Google Verbal Behavior Conference, and the registration page will come up. So, again, I hope to see you there. Okay, I think that's it for opening remarks. So without any further delay, please enjoy this really fun and wide-ranging conversation with Dr. Greg Hanley.
Welcome to the Behavioral Observations Podcast, stimulating talk for today's behavior analysts. Now, here's your host, Matt Sikoria.
Dr. Greg Hanley, welcome back to Behavioral Observations. It's been a little while. There's a lot to catch up on. I'm looking forward to getting into it. How are you doing today?
I'm good, Matt. Thanks. Yeah, it has been a while. I don't know how much time, but it's been years. And I love your podcast, obviously, and I love the impact you have and how you've helped disseminate the work we care about. So I appreciate you and glad to be back.
Yeah, well, I mean, your content is the contributions you've made to the show also. But, when I look at the stats and look at like the top downloaded shows, like your number like 1, 2, 3, and like 5 and 7, it is crazy. Your shows have reached, and I'm not, this is no hyperbole here, hundreds of thousands of listeners, which is bonkers.
Amazing.
So anyway, all that to say, I think whenever you come on the show, a lot of people pay attention very closely to what you have to say. We'll get into that and lots more. So in the spirit of, I guess, catching up, let's just start out in general. Like, I think the last time you and I chatted, it was like deep in the middle of the pandemic. You had, I think not too long prior to the pandemic starting, you had just started FTF and you were on the road. You're going all over the world, literally. And then everything kind of ground to the halt. You're doing things through Zoom and Google Meet and things along those lines.
Yep.
We're out of the woods now, or perhaps as out of the woods as we're likely to get, and,
right on. Yeah, exactly.
And so I'm just wondering how things have changed yet again. So like, I think perhaps a feature might be a stable feature might be change, I suppose. But tell us what you, and not just you, but you've got a number of great colleagues as well that are working with you. So tell me what you guys have been up to.
Sure. COVID almost crushed us, like many people. But just through sheer accident, we had some film of our trainings, thanks to Ryan O'Donnell, and we're able to put those into on-demand courses and kind of keep connected to our community. And that was our saving grace. And then we really went down the path, created a lot of on-demand courses. The funny thing then is I would say, how silly was it that we would get on planes and say the same thing over and over again? But guess what? We're back to what we call FTF Live, and I'm getting on the road and doing it again. And because there's something to be gained by on demand, right? There's mastery, it's mastery based and self-paced, and there's all those advantages. But there's also advantages to live. We get to do actual design and application and meet with families and whatnot. So we've developed into this nice hybrid model, right? We have on-demand stuff. We're still getting on planes and going all over the world. And it's really great. And COVID was horrible, right? There was a lot of unfortunate things, right? Death that came from COVID. But at the same time, it made our company stronger and made us a little better able to connect with international folks. So we're super thankful about all that. And then obviously the company has grown. It was just a handful of us in the past, and now we have 10 or so full-timers and 25 including part-timers, and we're busy and we have a nice community, and I'm just thankful. I work with awesome people, and generally speaking, we enjoy what we're doing. It's hard, but we're enjoying it. As far as new stuff too, we kicked off credentialing between the last time we spoke and now, and I'm pretty happy where that's going. Again, we're just trying to protect the quality of the delivery of this thing we call practical functional assessment, skill-based treatment, any of the assessments for sleep and feeding. And I resisted it for a time because I'm a big fan of open source. You know what I mean? I love the Facebook group, and we just kind of put it in a peer-reviewed journal and make sure the appendix is there to get all the information out to people. But over time, realize this requires an apprenticeship often. This is a clinical process that's fairly intricate as you get into the weeds of it. And so the credentialing is really helping us inspire people to connect and get proper training and get consultation and get to real finish lines, not just end on kids saying my way, end on elimination of severe behavior in a general and maintained way in terminal context when implemented by parents and teachers. And credentialing is allowing us to get there with more people. So I'm pretty stoked about that.
Can you tell me a little bit about that, what that looks like?
I mean, basically, if there's 6 or 7 levels, and the first level is knowledge. And so either take a mastery-based on-demand course and then pass the test, and you have knowledge, right? Or go to a live workshop. And second level is application, and that's where people do a workbook and design the entire treatment process out, actually apply it to a client, and we have evidence of the application. And then levels 3 and 4 are support or lead implementer, and that requires proof of implementing SBT with some fidelity, and that requires videos. And so we either get the video proof through consultation, or people can apply through what we call an alternative pathway. And we have somebody on staff, Alex Beckwith, who's amazing at this process, and she reviews the videos and the data sheets and the graphs. So it's not just passing a test. That's level 1. You get up to level 3 and 4, that means you're doing it, and you're doing it with some fidelity. And then level 5 is advanced education, means you're taking more courses, got into the weeds with it. Level 6 is you've created supervision, and that means you've created a meaningful outcome for 2 or 3 learners at a distance, meaning you didn't do direct implementation, you supported others doing direct implementation, and which is where most BCBAs find themselves, right? Even newly minted ones are finding themselves in a supervisory role, and so we graduate up to supervision. And then those that are in our clinical meetings every week, members of FTF, our international ambassadors and full-timers and part-timers, they're what we call level 7 consultant. And that's because they're getting the latest information every week. And we just put out this new thing for credentialed people too, Matt. It's called Big Ideas and New Discoveries. About every 6 weeks, we give a free lecture to those who are credentialed. And it's basically the latest thing that either is coming out in research, but is going to take a while to hit the journal, or is just something that we as a clinical team have agreed this is the new way we're doing the process because we have so many iterations, and it's painfully obvious that we need to pivot a little bit because it's a flexible process. And so this Big Idea New Discovery thing, maybe my favorite thing of this last year, because it allows us to connect with people on new ideas, and people aren't shocked when they see a journal article come out in 2 years from now, seeing how the process has changed. So that's credentialing. People come to FTF and go through the process there.
What I want to get to what is new and what you've learned through this process over the last, I suppose, decade or so, likely more. But you mentioned something, things that you guys are going to, or that are in the research pipeline. Is that something that you're able to speak to right now in terms of some findings that you guys are seeing? Or maybe that's rolled up into my next question, which is, again, what is new? What have you guys learned from this process? So the answers might overlap, I guess. So I'll let you kind of take that whatever direction you like.
Okay. Yeah. No, you're right, Matt. It does overlap. And I wish we were doing more research, to be frank. COVID slowed it down, and starting FTF has slowed down research, but we still have irons in the research fire, thank goodness, and we're learning new things. The funny thing is, Matt, though, and I'm at a kind of a crossroads as a researcher. I'm a practitioner, I'm a researcher, both, but I'm at a crossroads as a researcher because I've learned recently, the last 5 or so years, that I'm learning so much about this process through just a volume of implementation, being part of a team where we have so much implementation going on. The clients and the people, the implementers, are teaching us what needs to change about this process. And it's a little bit more of a fast-paced learning experience than my decades research career has been. I'm also struggling coming up with control conditions for some of my research because I don't want to put kids through the paces of the thing that isn't right. And so I'm at a crossroads, to be frank, as a researcher. I'm really trying to figure out progressive control conditions that are defensible and whatnot. And so we're really learning a lot merely through application. And I know that's a slippery slope. And so we got to get back to some more controlled research, no doubt. But as far as the new things, the things we're learning, there's a lot. I don't want to go too deep down here, but I'll try to stay limited here. The first thing we're learning is that we call it PFA. You know this process well, practical functional assessment, skill-based treatment. The PFA part, it just works. So people are still like doing theses, comparing this to that and standard analyses versus PFA. And I just I just don't have much room in my world for that anymore, because the PFA process is like flying a plane. It just works. Okay. And I know planes crash, and planes crash about as often as the PFA doesn't work. What I'm saying is there's 3 missions with this PFA. The first one is to bring the joy, to make sure through non-contingent provision of suspected reinforcers, we can get this kid somewhat happy, relaxed, and engaged and ready for the challenges we're about to present them. And we do that. There are times that we can't get HRE. There are times. It's usually older learners, residential, heavily medicated, don't trust adults anymore. That's still a struggle. But all that really means is we need to spend more time with that person in that context. And so getting the HRE mission is on point. Turning on problem behavior. The funny part is when you ask people, what's the probability you think we're going to turn on this student's problem behavior? They say 10. Always say 10. 10 out of 10. It's going to happen. The funny thing is, maybe 1 out of 4, 1 out of 5 cases, it doesn't happen. It doesn't happen because people are so damn good at bringing the joy right now in this process. It in and of itself is an independent variable. And when you put that establishing operation in the challenge, you ask them to put down their iPad and go do some work. They're like, okay, whatever you want. You're the only person in my life that brought in 3 plungers, 2 umbrellas, and a bubble machine, and I have all my reinforcers at once. And so that has this therapeutic effect. That's what I've learned recently. I've learned just the amazing power of 5 minutes of non-contingent provision of all the reinforcers, and especially the provision of the things kids with autism have lost in the past because they loved them too much. You know what I mean? They love action figures, but they lose it when people, ask them to play peacefully, or they remove them. And so no more action figures at school, no more action figures at home. Once we bring all that stuff back, the therapeutic action of that is pretty powerful. So that's been a cool learning experience. We eventually do turn on problem behavior too, by the way. It just may take some trials.
Being a behavior professional is hard, but at How to ABA, our goal is to make your job just a little easier. Hi, I'm Shira.
And I'm Shayna. And we're here to personally invite you to join over 3,000 ABA professionals in our Behavior Resource membership.
Inside the membership, you'll find all the assessments, programs, data sheets, and materials you need to teach children with autism so that they make real progress. We even include how-to videos for you.
As a member, you will be invited each month to attend a live CEU on a variety of meaningful topics that you can actually use, in addition to an extensive library of recorded on-demand CEUs that you can access anytime. We give you more than enough for recertification.
And when you're stuck, we have our private members-only community group that's not on Facebook. Whether you're a beginner or a long-time practitioner, you'll benefit from a supportive community behind you.
Imagine an all-in-one resource to save you time and help your clients. Imagine having support and getting your toughest questions answered. And imagine being a part of a collaborative private group of professionals to share ideas.
So go to howtoaba.com/join. And when you join today, use the code BOP. You'll receive 10% off a yearly subscription, which includes CEUs.
Hang on here. So I just want to, there's two things I think you went over quickly here. I do want to just circle back to real quick, and I'll take them, I guess, in reverse order. So if I understand you correctly here, what you're saying is when you populate or flood the environment with high preference interactions and activities, that alone creates more of that increases the likelihood of cooperation for historically non-preferred stuff that the individual. Okay.
100%.
All right. Got you there. And I want to go back to individuals you can't get HRE for, because that is something that there's been cases that I've seen just in my own work and I'm like, man, I'm trying to provide this kid. I want to move heaven and earth for this kid,
right? Of course,
and give him all the stuff and whatnot, and they're still having meltdowns and so forth.
Right.
So I would love. I know you said you weren't going to get in the weeds, but I think that's something perhaps worthwhile getting into the weeds over.
Of course, the thing is, Matt. The thing is, some confusion about this process too is, people are trying to get HRE on a 20 all waking hours basis, and we always remind people this is a tier 3 intervention, folks. This is one-on-one therapy. Okay. And it's not necessarily an all day thing in the beginning. First things first, can you get HRE with one person in one context for a certain period of time? And then from there, we will build it out. Maybe more time, more people, more places. It builds out throughout the course of treatment. So when people a lot of times saying, I can't get HRE, I'm getting meltdowns during the day. I'm like, well, you're doing this on a 24/7 basis, but that's not the kind of thing it is, right? This is a one-on-one therapy to start out. It's a proving ground. You know what I mean? You got to prove it first with a limited amount of time, one person, one place, or two people, a couple places, that sort of thing. But that said, there are some learners for whom we don't get HRE in a traditional sense. And again, Matt, people like to bust my chops a little bit and email me, especially newly minted BCBAs, and like, excuse me, Dr. Hanley, or I get, hey, it depends. The email greetings vary tremendously. Hey, can you define HRE? And most of the time I don't, but if I do respond, I basically say, listen, the parent or teacher will know what HRE is for that learner, or the group home staff will know. You can't define it. There is no omnibus definition that's going to be generally applicable, but you know it when you see it. We say in a snarky way, it's like pornography. HRE is like pornography, hard to define, but you know it when you see it. And so we just say, go with it and do your darndest, like you said, to provide all reinforces non-contingently, and then see how they behave. For some kids, HRE is more what we change the acronyms, it's CRE. They're content, relaxed, and engaged. For some kids, they're happy, jacked, and engaged. They're jumping up and down on a trampoline, listening to Lady Gaga, shaking the entire room, right? And so the point, what I try to get across to people is the spirit of HRE. And I know as a behavior analyst, that's a little fuzzy. The spirit of HRE is this. We're doing a functional analysis, and we're about to bring the doom to this learner. We're about to purposely impose things that we know have historically evoked severe behavior. So the point is, don't do that unless the child or student is physiologically and affectively ready for that challenge, so they don't escalate and kick you in the face in the beginning. Do you know what I mean? So the spirit of it is just don't put EOs in on a time-based schedule like we've been doing for 30 years in functional analysis. That is short-sighted. Look at your client. Make sure they're ready for the challenge, so when they engage in that behavior, that operant, you want it to effectively operate on the environment, not be emotional and something that is going to be insensitive to the consequences that you have your ability to manage at that moment. So again, the point of HRE is really not necessarily just about bringing the joy. The point of HRE is to make sure the child is ready for the next step of our process. And in assessment, it's putting in the EO for the first time. In treatment, it's putting in a challenge so we can teach skills. That said, what do we do when we can't get HRE? We settle for good enough. We don't let perfect be the enemy of the good. So we try our hardest. We put everything in there people who know and love that student tell us are important to them. And we also, if we can't get it very well, we have someone watch us. There's a lot with body positioning. Where are you sitting? Are you behind the kid? Freaking them out. Are you staring at him? Freaking them out. Are you sharing the experience or supervising the experience? Because if you're supervising it, you're freaking them out. If you're sharing it, you're doing good. It's hard because some people say, but you said in the course, don't touch their shit. I say that all the time to people. Stop touching the kids' toys. Stop touching their stuff. That's an EO. And wait until they, ask you for participation. By contrast, with an adolescent or an adult, you kind of got to share the experience. If they're playing video games, you're playing video games with them. So it's an iterative process, and you have to trust. You have to start in one place that's really risk averse. We're just going to sit low, be submissive, and follow their lead. Then over time, you have to change what you're doing to try to bring as much joy as possible. And then you have to end it. At some point, you have to say, this is good enough. They're not smiling, but they've engaged in a few social bids towards me. They're clearly comfortable in this space right now. I think I'm going to go to the next step in the process and put some EOs in. So we have some work to do, Matt, clearly making HRE more technological. But the funny thing is, we've trained hundreds of people to do this, and I still haven't defined HRE, and they're kicking ass at doing it. So, you know what I mean? It's happening. Again, back to that notion of not turning it on. It eventually turns on as long as people know how to progress the EO, as we say. So historically, we would do this, and people's reinforcement environment was amazing. They had all this amazing stuff. In the table of high expectations, the work we were going to do with the learner, the challenging things, there'd be like a puzzle or some like IQ materials that were dusty. And we don't do that anymore. We call them branches, and we're very deliberate in what are the contextually appropriate behaviors that are most important for this learner that they're not omitting because of severe behavior. And we don't do the analysis unless we know that stuff with specificity. In other words, they say demands. They have to, come on instructional control. Okay, with what? Math. Okay, what kind of math? Addition. What kind of addition? How much addition? How much support are you giving them? What's the curriculum? And then we have all that stuff available on the table. So when we put in the EO and the child just acquiesces, we're progressing them and holding them to such a developmental high level that the next time we put the EO in, we usually see the protest behavior or some problem behavior. It's not, doesn't happen. It's just delayed. And the other part of this process that I've learned, and I'm perhaps most happy with, is the third part of our mission, right? The first is get HRE. The second is turn on behavior. And the third is turn it off. If you turn it on, you know the EOs. If you turn it off, you probably know the reinforcers. And that's the part most people are most scared of. So we say, you think you're going to get HRE? They're like, oh, yeah, 10 out of 10. You think you're going to turn on problem behavior? They're like, oh, yeah, 10 out of 10. You think you'll be able to turn it off immediately? 3 out of 10. No one's confident they can turn off problem behavior because they've never seen that. Despite being a behavior analyst, they usually haven't seen that in their career. What they see is the awkward behavior that turns into emotional behavior that's just a mess in the classroom. So they don't see it turning off. The funny thing is, in this process now, behavior turns off all the time. We do not get escalation in the analysis because we spent so much the last 5 years doing research on making sure that doesn't happen. Progressing the EO super slow, using an open contingency class, making sure you reinforce any first response, even if it's delightful, even if it's polite and communicative, reinforce it. And then we'll deny it after a few trials in. In other words, HRE, we generally get it. It can be hard. It might take some time for older learners. Turning on the behavior actually is the hardest part sometimes because of that risk-averse nature of this process. And then the third part, turning it off, everyone's afraid they won't be able to do so, and they always do so. I'm not afraid of that anymore. That's a big thing we've learned.
Hey everyone, I just want to take another quick minute here and give a shout out to Behavior University for sponsoring this episode. I'm on their website right now, and it's really remarkable the diversity of topics that they have for continuing education. They, of course, have RBT courses, 8-hour supervision courses, But just looking at some of the on-demand stuff that they have, they've got ABA applications for health and fitness with Bobby Newman and Julie Slowiak, ASD in the criminal justice system, food selectivity, treatments without escape extinction. That's taught by Dr. Holly Gover, who's been on the podcast previously, leveraging social media and applied behavior analysis from Ryan O'Donnell, medically necessary ABA session notes. Ooh, that sounds like it's kind of like the thing like where you got to eat your vegetables because they're healthy. You know, it's one of those things you kind of have to know. And there's lots of other things too, supervision, ethics, things along those lines. So to learn more about what their offerings are, go to behavioruniversity.com, and to get a discount just for Behavioral Observations listeners, get the code over at behavioruniversity.com/observations. All right, let's get back to the rest of this conversation. I think in previous conversations we've had some discussion around the boundary conditions for the skills-based treatment process. And if I recall correctly, I think I don't want to put words in your mouth, so feel free to edit this if I don't get it exactly right. But I think you said something to the effect of, when the reinforcers are sex, drugs, and rock and roll, it's a little difficult to intervene. Meaning
that's still true.
Okay. So the translation of that is that, at a certain developmental level, the skills-based treatment process may not necessarily be the appropriate tool or intervention tool. So you said that's still true. Are there other aspects of the boundary conditions that you've learned? Are the boundary conditions wider now, if you will, for the applicability of skills-based treatment?
Yeah, ironically, Matt, I think they're not wide; they're narrow. They're more narrow now than they have been.
Okay,
but I'll tell you what the boundaries are. Yeah. If it's a child 12 and under, it's applicable if they have what other people call an externalized behavior disorder. If a child is engaging in self-injury, aggression, or property destruction with any regularity, this process is for them. And there's representation of children with and without autism, with and without intellectual disability in the literature already. So children, again, it's for kids who are engaging in outward directed behavior, right? Dangerous behavior to themselves, to others, to the environment. And it's good there. As far as adults, there's obviously less representation with adults, but when there are adults in the research literature, as well as in our clinical support systems, they all have intellectual disabilities. So this is a process for adults with intellectual disabilities. And then the gray area where the expansion of competence is really happening is adolescence. And it's really expanding scope of competence towards students with good language without intellectual disabilities that have more like educational classifications or psychiatric classifications. Now, we've been doing this process with those kind of learners from the beginning. The free clinic in Springfield was really for folks who didn't have the right diagnosis for services. But the research literature was finally seeing these kind of students populated in the research literature. A good article, the articles on the enhanced choice model by Aditya and Rajaraman and by the Staubitzes from Triad. And they're all together now down there at Vanderbilt. Those two articles on the enhanced choice model, I think, are leading the expansion of the scope of competence. But we have work to do. We have work to do to teach people how to prime kids for sessions, how to do reflections after sessions, so they make sure in session they're coming under control of contingencies and the experience is changing behavior, and that the words, the languaging is happening before and after session. So that's something we talk a lot about in consultation, but that's stuff we need to get in the research literature. And so we're back with, who is this not applicable for? It's not applicable for adults without intellectual disabilities. Clear. It's not applicable to adolescents for whom you can't get in the building. You know what I mean? They're running around, again, sex, drugs, guns, and hip hop, or whatever you want to say. Sadly, I do think there's elements of this process that could be applied, but there's other therapies that are more relevant and other support systems that are needed for those learners. We are working with adolescents, and we sometimes do support indirectly learners who won't leave their bedroom, for instance, the kid with autism who's learned to not go to school, just play video games or be online, and his parents leave his dinner and his meals at the door because if they go in there, it's going to be a show. And that takes time. We teach BCBAs to go to the house and not talk to that adolescent, to simply hang out with the families and talk about anything but that learner. Bring a bundt cake, have cake, have coffee, just be present and wait for that student to show some interest. And it's a grind. It's a grind to get those kids out of that bedroom. I'd say that is a new research area that we're working on. I'd say the last thing in this area is there's Matt Carbone is he's a student, but he works at FTF now. He's about to graduate with his PhD, and his dissertation is really about doing this process in a less controlling way. And I think that's what we need to work with these adolescents that we're speaking of. It's a less controlling way. It's a less transactional way. And it's more about there's a place to achieve, and there's a place where we'll follow your lead. And so, and it's about helping them make the choice to go achieve. It's not on our timetable. We don't stand up and clap and say, okay, video games are up. It's time to do your homework. Or it's time to do your therapy. It can't work that way with these kids. Okay. So we're trying to talk a little bit more about it, make sure they know that there are options, and really just slow play the fact that there are other things to do than passive activities that they're generally doing right now. And we're there to support them. And there's a little bit of ACT involved in this application. We really got to talk to these adolescents, figure out what their goals are, what their values are, the extent to which they're living according with them. They're not, and help them figure out the way to get there.
I want to go back to those individuals in the gray area, and when you said you prepping them before the session and reflecting after, that really piqued my interest. It made me wonder if if you're working with students in a context where they have really good language, is not an intellectual disability, to what extent is the skills-based treatment like a rule governance aspect versus something that's directly contingency shaped? Do you feel in other words, I can imagine prepping an individual by saying, hey, we're gonna build this car with this Lego set. Okay, I'm going to interrupt you periodically, and if you just say my way, then it's right. We're right back at. Is that kind of what you're saying? Is that?
No, I appreciate you clarifying this. I want to make something super clear, Matt. That's exactly what we don't do.
Okay, all right.
We used to. Historically, in standard analyses, we would do that kind of stuff. If you do this, then this happens. There is no, in our prime, there is no if-then. Because we don't want, like you implied, we don't want rule governance necessarily. Listen, kids are going to generate their own rules if they have language, and they may be governed by the rules they generate. We want the rules they generate to be consistent with the contingencies, and we don't want to get in the way of that. So what we do in the prime, the prime is not as important as the reflection, the bookend, the end of session. But in the prime, we just try to, be a little dignified with the process, saying, hey, we're going to go in here. Things are going to get hard. I know you can handle the hard things. We're going to practice for the big game of life, classroom. It depends on the kid. We'll try to use language that works with them, but we are speaking in amazing generalities. And we're just trying to give the impression that we're there for them. And that's it. We're going to go practice. We always call it practice. We're going to practice some skills. We do not say what we're going to do, what's required of them, and what we're going to do after they engage in any particular behavior. Okay, so the prime is super general, and it's really to sit down literally in a chair outside the therapy room and just say, also, before we walk in the room, is there anything you want me to know? Anything you want to tell me before we go and practice skills? That's the biggest part of prime. A lot of times kids like to unload. They say, yeah, I've had a terrible day, and my father this and this and that. And we let them just kind of language a bit. I want them, like you implied, I want them out of their, Steve Hayes used to say, out of their head and into their life in session. I want it controlled by the contingencies. I want them to learn through the contingencies, because what we're doing, we know that generalization can be mediated by language, right? That's lovely. But we're trying to push kids and challenge them in ways that their heart rate gets up there. We're challenging them in skill-based treatment. They're on the edge sometimes. There's a little precursor behavior, and we acknowledge that precursor behavior, and we still ask them to persist. That's when these skills generalize. We're not, with these older learners, we have to be really careful. We're not doing role play. This is not role play therapy. We are trying to, as best as possible, recreate the conditions that are amping you up in the classroom, in life, and in the home, emulate those as close as possible and teach you can persist. You can do this. So again, but there's a misunderstanding about SBT, I think, with these language able learners, that it's instructed, that it's role play. It's not. It's not that at all. And the other thing that's relevant is a lot of times people say there's no extinction in SBT. Well, that's not true either. It's never been true. In fact, we used to do more standard types of extinction in the past, but what we've learned now is, and it seems like a good time to talk about this, let's say you got that language able learner, you're in session, yeah? And people say, how do we respond if problem behavior occurs? The first thing is we bifurcate the repertoire into dangerous behavior and non-dangerous behavior. I don't care about every damn topography.
Right.
We don't have the bandwidth to record everything anymore, and we're doing actual therapy here.
Yeah, it's the R1 and R2 in your parlance, right? Yeah.
That's exactly right. So I just care, is it an R1? Is it dangerous or is it non-dangerous? Now, listen, if it's a non-dangerous behavior, we do what's probably best called partial extinction, meaning we immediately acknowledge it. If they kind of get ticked off and push the math away and say, I'm done, I hate you, I hate math, there is no ignoring behavior in SBT. There's a one-on-one tier 3 intervention with kids with a history of severe behavior. Ignoring that behavior is ludicrous. We always acknowledge the behavior, and we do so with empathy. I understand this is hard and you're frustrated with me. So we give attention. We always give attention. But we withhold escape, tangibles, controls, whatever reinforcers are also on deck. And we do that through what's called by other people encouragement. You know what I mean? So it doesn't look like extinction in the old days. The kid has a problem with number 5 on math. I'm trying to get him to do 10. I'm not going to have him, when he has a little wordy meltdown, I hate you and I hate math. I'm not going to go do 6, do number 6 like this. You do it, do number 6 and grab his hand. So that's not what I mean by extinction. People are correct in the sense we're not doing that. Okay, we're doing televisable extinction, which is more like this. I understand math's hard. You're frustrated. I've seen you do hard things. I know you can do it. Give it a shot. We're basically saying keeping the EO in place, right? We're giving attention, but withholding those other reinforcers. And then we're also modifying the criteria for reinforcement. If I want him to do 10, but the kid just does 2 more, I'm going to hit that with reinforcement and say, I love how you persisted. That was hard. You were on the edge, but you did it. Do you want to go back to your way? You want to finish your math. So that's the therapy in SBT. And people who know how to do it well are doing that. And they're not doing it in a black and white sort of way. That we're reinforcing minor problem behavior will be a grind. It'll be too slow and that kid will never achieve. And generalization will be hard for that skill set. On the other hand, if you go into old school, ignore the behavior and all that, you're going to break down the relationship, and that's not going to work out so well either. So it's nuanced, this thing. Now, on the flip side, Matt, if dangerous behavior occurs, that same kid out of blue, he flips the table, we're done. We reinforce that and say, you go your way, I'm here for you. And we just turn it down. And that's still a bitter pill for people to swallow. I still see faces when I do Zoom talks and live talks, and people like, you what? You want me to reinforce severe behavior? I'm like, yeah, because we're behavioral scientists and we know how to turn off behavior. And you prove that in your analysis. So let's leverage that knowledge. So anyways, I hope that is clarifying a little bit about how SBT is done these days.
Yeah. I guess I have 2 reactions to that. I guess relative to what you just described there, there's a lot of conditional discriminations going on. So the analyst, the interventionist has is processing a lot of kind of almost if-then statements, in their head as they're, should I move forward? Should I move back? How do I do that? And things like that. So that's really that, at least to my mind, sounds like it requires a lot of practice and a lot of supervision and a lot of feedback. And so, yeah, I'm just reacting to this. I'm not putting a judgment on that one way or another. I'm just marveling at the skill level that's required to do this in a way that is sensitive and supportive to the individual, and at the same time moves the ball downfield.
Right.
So
you're right, Matt. It's not easy. That's just it. PFA is easy. I'm just telling you, like, I don't worry about that anymore. I don't lose sleep over people supporting people do practical functional assessment, including the analysis, the ISCA. I don't worry about that. But doing SPT, you are right. It is hard. Now, given that, if people remember the values, safety first, make sure it's televisable, your relationship is as important as your objectives. If they remember those values, and the supervisors give the implementer some leeway to think and behave in the moment, people can do this independent of degree. So you don't need a PhD. You don't need a master's degree. You don't need to be a BCBA. We train people all over the world to do this. And a lot of our implementers, high school degrees, college degrees, they're DSPs, they're, all the acronyms, direct support, educational techs, educational assistants. It's complicated, but you just need to be shown the way. Do you know what I mean? It is conditional discriminations. What's right for how we behave in the PFA is different in SPT, right? In the analysis, reinforced everything. In SPT, bifurcate the repertoire. There are conditional discriminations, but I tell you, if people get supervision and they get out to that meaningful outcome and they see a couple other examples, their colleagues doing a couple examples, they know how to do this. But I don't think you can learn it just from an article or an on-demand course. I think you need someone a few chapters ahead of you, giving you feedback on things, and then the learning can be expedited that way. But it's not a surprise, right? Like, if you read a manual on how to tune an old carburetor, your carburetor would still smoke. You know what I mean? It still would be trouble. But if someone who knew how to tune a carburetor was with you, would show you how to tweak the screws and whatnot, you'd probably be good to go. It's like anything complicated in medicine or in mechanics. You need a bit of an apprenticeship to learn to do this kind of stuff.
Hey there, I hate to keep popping in like this, and this is not a paid advertisement, but I think it's a good time to at least emphasize that if you do want additional training in anything relative to practical functional assessment and skills-based treatment, go to the show notes for this episode. I've got links to all of FTF's offerings there, and they do have quite a bit. And there's a number of different ways they can support practitioners who want to learn and implement these processes. All right, let's get back to the conversation. That's a good point to underscore. And again, one other thing you said a few minutes ago, I want to return to real quickly. And I'm for some reason I'm fascinated with the kind of preview or how you contrasted my interpretation of how you preview these things with language able individuals versus how you actually do it. So walk me through a case where there is let's say a 9 or 10-year-old in an elementary school, throwing chairs and things like that. Yeah. You show up. How do you facilitate? Like, how do you even introduce the process to the individual? Meaning that because you started the story when you're going to the therapy room to do the skills-based treatment or the PFA or whatever stage you happen to be at the time. What are some ways to even bring this up? So if you have an individual has had no treatment previously. Yeah. They got referred to you. They're still in the classroom. The school doesn't know what to do or how to support this kid. This kid might not have any services yet, so it doesn't have the repertoire of going to get speech therapy, going to get pull out math and reading instruction, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah. How do you broach that with the learner without having to without much explanation? To get them to that room in the first place. So, does someone just say, "Hey, this is Dr. Hanley. He's here to help you," and then, or how does that work?
To be frank, Matt, I don't do direct anymore. I'll readily admit it. But I want to make it clear: very few people on my team do either, and because we've learned through this process that as the expert outsider, we facilitate the interview. But the teachers and parents and direct support, educational techs, whatever, they teach us about the kid. During that process of that open-ended interview that's been on the books for a decade now, in the open-ended interview, after that, we're going to go into design, right? We're going to design the analysis, okay? And when we design the analysis, the first thing we talk about is who's going to be the implementer? Who's going to implement this? The days of Dr. Hanley being the implementer are done, because I have no relationship with these kids as a consultant. The implementer, we always say there's 3 things we want the implementer to have. This is the discussion we have. Number 1, they need knowledge of the process. Do not put an educational tech as the one doing the ISCA when the BCBA took the course. Don't remote control that person. Treat them with respect. If you want them to be an implementer, they need knowledge. So make sure they go to a workshop or go to an on-demand course. We have a course now for behavior techs, not just BCBAs. Make sure they have knowledge. Number 2, make sure they have time with the student. The dosage needs to be upper skill-based treatment. They need time with the student. 30 minutes a week ain't going to cut it. So we need someone with at least 2 hours, 3 hours a week with that child. And that's usually a direct support person, right? An educational tech, etc. Then the third part is, especially if the child, like you said, I love your setup. They don't have much of a history with pullout and all that. I want the implementer, again, knowledge, time, and trust. Does this kid have a little trust? I know they're throwing things and whatnot, but who would they be okay with? Who do they go to the bathroom with? Who do they walk out to the playground with? Who gets them on the bus? Who gets them off the bus? That's the person that probably is going to be our implementer. We're going to make sure they get the course. We're going to make sure they have approval to spend enough one-on-one time with this kid. And then that person's going to say, hey, let's go play. We got a bunch of good stuff down here. You want to go play? Again, this whole thing about assent, which I'm sure we'll talk about later, assent really comes into play when we do SBT. With the analysis, we just kind of show up and say, hey, do you want to go play? And that person, again, who they trust, it's not me, it's a person they've known already. They walk down the hallway, they go into a room, and it looks like nothing they've ever seen, right? You know how this works. All the tangibles that are possibly reinforcing are there. All the stuff they love is in one place. You're kind of supposed to blow their mind. So we have the person they trust, walk them down the room to a pull-out location. They walk into the room, it looks amazing, and they just run in and get engaged. That implementer sits and just follows their lead for a time. Then they progress EOs, they empower that kid, they teach them the first little response. I reinforced it. Therefore, there's no need to throw chairs in here. You throw chairs in the classroom, but in here, there's no need because I'm going to reinforce the very first instance of problem behavior. And then their relationship is off. And now we're off to SBT. Now, when we do SBT the next day, we try to teach that implementer how to make it an assent model. And it's very simple. You just say to the kid, hey, do you want to stay in the classroom? Or do you want to go to that room and practice? That's it. And if they say no, we say, we'll check in with you later. And we check in with them based on that implementer's time availability. If they say yes, we go down the hallway, leave the door open, and we give them a reminder. If they got good language, we say, listen, if anytime you're done with this, you can go back to the classroom anytime. Door's open. And then we go. It's like a free operant preference assessment, Matt. That's what I love about it. If the kid chooses to not participate, it means something aversive is in that space or something appetitive is missing. It's a nice free operant test. That's why I like assent. I didn't get into the assent models out of the warmness of my heart like some people, the better people than me, perhaps. I got into this assent model 20 years ago doing concurrent chains arrangements and these kind of free operant kind of assessments to figure out where kids wanted to behave, where their preferences were, and then figuring out what the universal preferences were for kids with severe behavior. So I hope that answers the question about how we go. Again, knowledge, time, and some trust or some relationship. That's usually our first implementer.
Got it. That's that's a very helpful clarification. I feel like we are addressing a lot of questions that I think a lot of listeners have on their minds relative to this process. So this is really good. And I suppose related to that, when you and I had kind of a preview conversation last week about some potential discussion topics, and one of the things that came up is you had said something about ideas and concepts that kind of transcend the PFA SBT process that have perhaps applicability elsewhere in behavior analytic practice. So I'd like to get your thoughts on that while we're on the topic of what you've learned about this, through this endeavor, this I guess journey over the last several years that you've been on.
Yeah, well, I appreciate even the chance to think about it, Matt, because this is a kind of a novel question that you posed to me a few days back, and I kind of have mixed responses. Some people take bits and pieces of this PFA SBT process, and part of me wishes they did it the way it's described in the research literature, right? It's an evidence-based practice. You know what I mean? And I'm not sure we should just take bits and pieces of it. But at the same time, a lot of kids, they're not at the point, or the resources don't allow for them to get the technological process we call PFA and SBT. And so when I think about it that way, there are things that can be exported in general. I think one of the first things is this concept of HRE for kids who are at risk or are engaging in problem behavior. And again, the point isn't HRE per se, which is confusing. The point is, don't challenge the student or learner until they're physiologically and affectively ready for the challenge. And if I can walk through any classroom and just see public school is a time-based entity. It has to be, as we move kids around. Everything's based on time. And I can respect that, but at the same time, within those time units, within the small group instruction, to be sensitive to the physiological and affective status of that kid before you challenge them, when problem behavior may be around the corner, I think is a really powerful thing. And people have told me that. People have told me this concept of kind of looking at the learner and not just doing 10 trials based on 30-minute intervals, 30-second intervals and all that, but just to see if they're ready for the challenge. Obviously, the goal of therapy is to be able to challenge them at any time, independent of HRE. That's back to those conditional discriminations you mentioned. But in the beginning of the process, when kids are at risk or engaging in problem behavior, we should be mindful maybe of this concept of when we challenge. We're always about what do we teach and how do we teach and how do we manage the behavior. We don't talk a lot about when. When's important. And when is based on their performance. And this HRE stuff is performance. It is observable, So that's something. I guess the other thing, too, is, I'm just beating the drum here. We've been talking about this for years, but synthesized reinforcement. I still struggle when people are having these reinforcement programs for kids with severe behavior, and they're a single reinforcer. Praise, token, cookie, privilege, treat, just like... Synthesized reinforcers have a power that can't be found in any individual reinforcer. And so I think it's really exportable to recognize that reinforcers combined have more power than singular reinforcers. We have review papers on it. There's not a single study in the literature showing that a single reinforcer has a better effect on behavior than a combined reinforcer. That's power. We don't have that kind of power in behavior analysis to say things, to such an extreme. So I do think this notion of combining reinforcers and not sweating break or tangible, it's break to tangible and attention. And there's probably some sensory. And by the way, there's some other reinforcers too outside the canonical, right? Sometimes a kid just wants to best you, dominate you, give it up, follow their lead. Sometimes kids want to engage in preferred conversation. Say it, put it in the note. They are escaping to talk about plungers. Don't just put break. Make sure everyone knows that these combined reinforcers have power. The other one is intermittent, unpredictable reinforcement. I think that schedule has power, and not foreshadowing, not using if-thens, not doing all that stuff, but just letting the kids sit in the pocket of ambiguity, and reinforcement happens. Behavior analysts have been talking about that for 50 years. That's really how reinforcement was designed in application. And I like that return to that. A lot of times, Matt, people think I hate token boards because I rail on them in some of these trainings.
Yes, let's talk. So let's spend some time on this, because there was some discussion in one of the Facebook groups, and I couldn't find it. I was going to send you the link to it, and so you could kind of see what the discourse was.
Yeah.
So when I went to go look for it again, I wasn't able to retrieve it, but there was this interesting conversation that happened in one of the groups about the premise of the way. And I'm not, I don't mean this to be. I'm not making fun of anybody. I'm not trying to be disrespectful, but the I guess the gist of the original quote is, because we do PFA, we don't use token boards, ... and then proceed to the rest of the question. There was probably more context to it than that. So I might not be giving the most charitable rendition of that. But as you can imagine, there were like 50 to 100 comments that just, that stemmed from that, all about we do this, we don't do that, blah, 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 blah. So I want to give you the floor to talk about tokens.
All right. There's a lot in that question. Yeah, there's a lot to that, Matt. I will tell you, I'll start out this way, though. I follow the social media stuff because it's important, because I know where information flows. And so I'm checking it all out. But understand there's the social media portrayal of PFA and SBT, and there's the evidence-based practice known as PFA and SBT, and they're not the same. Mm-hmm. And so I always encourage people, read the article, you know what I mean? Go to the sources. It gets the nuance, right? The nuance gets lost when you're learning about things on social media. That said, I am definitely responsible for some of the polemic comments made on social media, because when I teach about this stuff, I'm hasty in wanting the change to happen at this point in my career. And so I do say things to push people off of traditional practices towards things that, again, have evidence behind them. And so to the token board, I have definitely screwed up my relationship with token boards to people because of things I've said in the past. So it goes like this. The reason why people say I'm doing PFA SBT, therefore I don't use token boards, is because I have said on multiple occasions, we don't use token boards with individual learners as a DRO to address severe behavior when we're doing this process. Okay, again, so it's contextual, right? In other words, in a one-on-one situation, if you're using tokens to say, oh, you went 5 minutes without SIB or aggression, here's a token. Oh, and by the way, you just slapped yourself, so now response cost, remove the token. I'm saying we don't do that in PFA and SBT. And when I say, I'm saying I'll even go never, and that's so not tentative, but I'm going to go there. We never use that. We just don't. And it's because that's BMOD, but the problem with it is it works a little bit. The problem is it works a little bit and it allows you to manage that problem, but it doesn't allow you to solve the problem. And I'll still stand by the statement. I can't find a single study where the starting point is a DRO-based token board for an individual and the end point is a socially validated outcome. We don't have a single study. So that's why I'm asking people to walk away from that kind of token board. Now, I didn't say walk away from token boards. You know what I mean? And so when can we use them? I think an okay use, and people are using this in SBT, is they use it in a form of a DRA for an individual. And it's when they're at that achievement table, a table of high expectations, and they're working on things that are hard. Learning is hard, and they're trying to get kids to try hard to be accurate, more independent, and you want to use tokens to reinforce accuracy or even engagement with the activity. I think that's lovely. I think adding a little incentive to do something that is not within the repertoire is beautiful. And to allow that kid to exchange the tokens in a traditional way for backup reinforcers, and we don't need to get into details over that, I think that's great. Do I think it's necessary? I don't, because we have over a dozen studies showing we do it without the token board, and we still get accurate and independent. But I can see why people want to do it. One, it helps SBT fit within their existing culture, the EIBI culture or what have you. But two, there are some learners that need incentives to learn. A lot of people think, because of this HRE concept, we think the whole process, the kid's just happy, relaxed, and engaged. That's not true. The kid's happy, relaxed, and engaged before we challenge them. But when we're challenging them, we're working on 30 minutes, a branch of 30 minutes of cooperative behavior. This sweat, it's not necessarily happy. I remember I had a conversation with Peter Gerhardt on some panel. He's like, learning's hard, Greg. It's not all happy. And I'm like, I know, man. I totally agree with you. So the point is, when learning is really hard, when you need that extra motivation to attend and inhibit a little stereotypy to focus on the concept class and whatnot, so be it. I support that. But I'll tell you, that's not my favorite. My favorite, Matt, and it's where we export this notion of intermittent, unpredictable reinforcement of these class-wide token boards. And I learned to do it well in Burlington Public School District. Years ago, I was a consultant for Burlington Public Schools in Massachusetts. And I met a lot of early childhood as well as elementary teachers that really had that class-wide stuff going. And together we collaborated and made this program we called the Spot You program in that school. And the Spot You program went like this. Kids would come in on the first day of school, literally the first day of school, and they would cut out dogs, let's say, from coloring books. They got to pick their doggie, and they cut it out, and they colored it, and they put their name on it, and they laminated it, right? All the stuff people love, lamination. And then they put little Velcro black dots. Every kid put 8 fuzzy spots on their dogs. The dogs get stapled to the wall. The teacher the next day has a behavior of the day. Let's say it's walking in the classroom. That's a very common behavior of the day on day 2 of class. When she spots a kid walking in the classroom, she just says, I spotted you. I spotted you. Okay. And she doesn't have to spot kids all the time. It's intermittent, unpredictable reinforcement because a teacher can't do it all the time. So they feel it's a guilt-free token board for the teacher because of intermittent, unpredictable reinforcement. And we also say spot behaviors of the day and behaviors of excellence. If you see something you love, a kid helping another kid, doing something, beautiful citizenship, what have you, just spot them. Say, I spotted you. Kids either go get their own spots and put it up on the board. That's a big deal for kids to be spotted. They get spotted, they show a little shine. They get to walk and put their little laminated black dot on their dog. When they get 8 black dots, they get to go to a bin or a trunk, and they get to get what I like to call bags of crap. They're like little brown bags with some shit in it, and they're stapled shut. And they got like spider rings or erasers or, what have you, whatever the teacher, wants to allow in his or her space. And then the program has all these graduation levels, and that's really the fun part. But again, remember, this is intermittent, unpredictable reinforcement, and it's good for the teacher. It also has that flexibility to reinforce, different behaviors across kids. It's also not stigmatizing because when you walk in the room, you can never tell the kid who's struggling with their behavior because it's not like a red light, green light program.
Oh,
okay.
Yeah.
It's which I can't stand those things.
Yeah.
This is like you never know. Yeah, exactly. Because it's just a running source. Sally, beautiful Sally, who's never had a misbehavior in her life, might have 1 spot. Whereas, Kevin, who's always messing up, he's got 7. You just never know.
It's always Kevin.
It's always Kevin. I know you have those names. But anyways, the graduation part of these Spot You programs is really neat. So first is you're allowed to open it up. So rip the staple off and get the thing, and everyone gets to see what you got in the moment. Then the next level is no opening. You just get the shine of getting the bag, but you got to put in your cubby. When you come in the next day, you show off your reward. Then the next level is when you earn your 8 spots, you can get a bag or you can have your friend get a bag. And now we're trying to build a little citizenship. Then the next level is you can get a bag, and now you can get a second bag and walk it to a classroom with a younger child, and you give it to anyone in the school. And then that kid gets to walk the hallways independently and get some shine. So everyone knows what a bag of crap means. It means that kid achieved. And so this concept of intermittent, unpredictable reinforcement, to me, makes token boards able to be implemented by teachers in classrooms, and the graduation model makes it so they like keeping it in place. Okay. And so that's something that, I learned to do this because of skill-based treatment. They're reinforcing certain skills. They're using intermittent, unpredictable reinforcement. And there's synthesized reinforcement out of this. Kids get to escape work, to hand the bag off to someone else. They're getting a lot of attention, and they get a little tangible. So it's not a single reinforcer. It's the acknowledgement of combined reinforcers. So I'm sorry if that was too long of a monologue.
No. That's a great, that's a very creative program, and one that I have not heard of before either. So I'm sure there's going to be a lot of folks in the audience like, ooh, I'm going to maybe see if I can take that for a test drive. So that sounds. I
hope they do.
It sounds pretty cool. That is really interesting. One of the things you said is I want to get back to the work is hard piece for a second, and I know you talk a lot about the importance of televisability of interventions. When you're talking about a 30-minute cab activity, I guess, where the kid's grinding it out and things like that, do you encounter in practice, or the feedback you get from your implementers that you're working with, that you're partnering with, do you get feedback? Do things sometimes in those situations break down and become perhaps either less televisable or at least things where you start to see problem behavior? And if so, what do you do in those circumstances?
Yeah, listen, the return, I'll call it return. People like to say resurgence sometimes, but resurgence, we should have better stimulus control over when we say that word. You need a certain preparation that is usually lacking when people say resurgence. But anyways, when behavior returns, problem behavior returns, and it's likely for some learners in the process, we teach people how to handle it. So, but let me be clear. A lot of times, Matt, nowadays, people in SBT, it's getting close to an errorless process.
Okay.
We're not seeing a lot of problem behavior because people know how to shape and chain, and they're being so responsive to the learner as we're moving that we're not seeing a lot of it. But that said, I mentioned earlier that sometimes R2s happen, and if problem behavior does return, it's usually an R2, a precursor to those severe behaviors. And when those happen, the modal advice is acknowledge it. Acknowledge it, okay? Don't ignore it, acknowledge it, and ask them to persist. And last, change the criteria for reinforcement in the moment, and then learn from that. So that said, if problem behavior returns in this process, we always ask people to learn from it. That's the first thing. Don't just count it, graph it, and do the same damn thing again. If problem behavior returns, learn from it. Now, a lot of times we say learn from, we're saying be analytic. Think, why? Why on this trial? Of all trials, why this time did it come back? And be careful of thinking about distal controlling events. People love to run to, you know what? Mom told me he didn't sleep last night, or he came in and he looked moody. It's all this stuff, these distal variables. And the second part of the process is you're being analytical. I want you to think in the moment, what you can control, put the onus on you. Was it how you presented the demand? Was it the manner in which you presented? Are you elongating the chain too long? And so we just ask people to be analytic in the moment and responsive to that return of problem behavior. And there's so many conditional discriminations here, Matt. It's hard. I'll give you just an example. Let's say they're doing a cab ranch. They're not at 30 minutes yet, Matt. Let's just say they're getting kids to relinquish their reinforcers in transition. If that kid is having a hard time relinquishing, because you're saying pause the iPad and put it in the bin, and they're like, immediate emotional reaction to that, we say just break that composite ask into its components. Just ask them to lower it. Just ask them to pause it, then they can unpause it, and then we'll build it up. Take the composite ask, relinquishing, and break it up into its components. That's easy enough. Transitioning, same thing. Now, let's say, though, Matt, we're at cab 5. And the kid's building endurance with stuff at the table expectations. And then we see relinquishing and transitioning breakdown. We're not going to break down those component skills into their composites. We know that we're asking the kid to do too much work. Even though we're seeing the breakdown at the early members of the chain, we know it's because the branches or the cab expectations are too much too soon. So what we're going to do there is change what we're doing at the table or decrease the amount of ask in some way. And that doesn't mean have them do less work. It might mean give them more support with their work. It might mean change the curriculum for the work. So there's a lot of things we're going to adjust. The bottom line is this. We ask people to simply be responsive to the return in problem behavior. Don't just count it and graph it and lament it. Do you see what I mean? Like respond to it and really think and own it. Don't blame it on something out of your control. Own it and change something. And by and large, that responsivity is helping people get to finish lines in SBT. And we never taught this well, 4 or 5 years ago. The language I'm using right now is not the language I used in the past. We taught persistence. Count it and keep it. Just stay there. And with enough practice, they'll figure it out. But that's not the case right now. I guess a different way to say it is we're learning from the student. The student is teaching. If they're having problem behavior, it basically means we're asking for too much too soon. Yes? That's the assumption. So change the ask.
Hey everyone, as a BCBA, meeting your continuing ed needs can be challenging at times. That's why I have made selected episodes of the Behavioral Observations podcast available for Type 2 continuing education credits. That's right. You can meet a portion of your professional development requirements on the go. Currently, we have CEs for topics including functional assessment, ethics, and supervision. Come learn from podcast favorites such as Greg Hanley, Pat Fryman, Mark Dixon, as well as many other amazing guests. For more information, head on over to behavioralobservations.com/get-CEs. So this has been a really great discussion of all the nitty-gritty detail here. Yeah. And again, I think there's a lot of folks in the audience are going to have a much clearer view of this process as a result. So I appreciate that.
Great.
I want to zoom out a little bit though, because there's some, I guess more, maybe it's big picture. I don't know, call it what you like, but I know the last time I think I had you on, we were talking about today's ABA, the essay that you had published. And since then, there's been a lot of other, I guess, types of, for lack of a better word, branding of ABA, and it's I've kind of settled on this term, what I call hyphenated ABA. This is like and it's not to diminish the importance of these things, but there's just so many of these hyphenated ABA terms, like trauma informed ABA, compassionate ABA, today's ABA, assent based ABA. And people are putting these things in their marketing materials for their programs and so on and so forth. And to that extent, this maybe goes back a little bit to the discussion of the tokens piece, but is there a risk of some, kind of rigid rule adherence as it relates to I practice trauma-informed ABA or I practice this type of ABA, and that might restrict the practice of the clinician? Again, we don't use tokens. We never use extinction. So there's like all, and I always get nervous when people use always and never in their language, unless they're really, really, really clear of what they're doing. I don't know if there's a question in there or not, but I'm just curious in terms of what your point of view is on a lot of this stuff.
I got you. It's complicated, man. This topic is so complicated. So I understand why it's even hard to ask a question on it, because it's complicated. But I have responses. As you were talking, I have responses. I don't even know where to start. I'll start with this. Number one, I resisted any hyphenated ABA for a long time. And people would say, this thing you're teaching us in this workshop or class or whatever, this isn't the ABA that I was taught. What do you call this ABA? Holistic ABA. And, people would offer me names or whatever. And I would say, it's just ABA. I say, just let's keep it as ABA. And I remember saying that on more than one occasion to people. Now, fast forward, as people were starting to denigrate ABA, not behavior analysts, but, maybe autistic voices and others. And I was worried a little bit about the acceptance of our field. And I was afraid I was seeing the baby, that's ABA, being thrown out with the bathwater, poor application of ABA. And I was concerned about that. And so it took me a while to embrace the idea of a hyphenated ABA, but I have embraced it. And I say the word today's ABA, which is without the hyphen, but nevertheless the same thing. It's a form of ABA. And I felt compelled to do that. I felt compelled to do that because it was painfully obvious to me that what I was teaching people to do was not what they were learning in graduate school, was not what they were seeing in our best journals. And I was having a hard time publishing the things that fall under the category of today's ABA in our journals. And so I thought it necessary. And I'll be honest, Matt, this is a little maybe too personal. I was close to just leaving the field. I'll call it gobbledygook. I don't care why. I got to call it something different because I'm not getting lost in getting all this feedback from this traditional ABA that I believe is poor application of ABA. Okay. And so, there was a time, and I talked to some people that matter to me in the field and some senior people, and I just explained, what I was challenged by. And that helped kind of keep me in line. And so this whole notion, understand today's ABA was not like a pre-planned thing. I wasn't saying like a deliberate, we got to distinguish ABA from this old ABA. I wrote that under duress of COVID and the Black Lives Matters movement going on and what I was experiencing in the city I was living in. And I saw the parallels between what was on my TV and what was in my neighborhood and what was happening in my field. And I just wrote that in one day, almost as a cathartic writing experience. And I didn't submit it to a journal because I didn't care for any feedback on it. I just wanted to post it. You know what I mean? I didn't care if I misspelled it or had poor syntax. I just was like, this is mine. This is personal. Thank goodness I have a free website. I'm just going to post it. So it wasn't this like big, thoughtful strategy or anything. If anything, I'll be honest, it was emotional. I was responding out of emotion, which you're not supposed to do as a behavioral scientist and a professional, but I did. And in hindsight, I'm super glad I did. In hindsight, I'm glad I did. And it made me start to, as I listened to others and I saw how people responded to that essay, I started learning from other people and what they were talking about and emphasizing. And I started to ask myself more broadly, what is the kind of practice that I want to practice? What do I want to do? What do I want my team to do? And then ultimately, what would I hope ABA does? Understand this notion of today's ABA, 80% of it is old ABA. I say that all the time in a full-throated workshop. I say, listen, this is shaping, chaining, task analysis, getting motivated control of behavior. I mean, so a lot of today's ABA, the technology is historic. And I try to point out those things because the history of our field matters a lot to me. But at the same time, I refuse to believe that what we're doing today, when we say today's ABA, compassionate ABA, trauma-assumed ABA, is the same as people have been doing for decades, because that is rubbish. Total rubbish. And I know it's rubbish because I've been around the field long enough and I've been trained by some of the best in the field, and I was not practicing the way I practice now. I was not practicing that way in the past. I'll just keep it simple. I don't call out what we do compassionate ABA, but I do say our ABA, the ABA we teach, or today's ABA is compassionate. What that means is it leads with concern for the learner in the moment. So in the past, when that little boy was sliding out of his seat and crying as I was teaching him to match colors and he was throwing the sample stimuli, I would just represent the sample. And I was doing it nice. I was trying to be nice about it. Don't match red like this. You do it. But I kept him in the pocket. His duress, his negative emotional responding was not on my radar. All that was on my radar was making sure that kid was compliant. And I knew how to teach him to behave more effective in that moment through escape extinction and procedures like that. And I didn't lose sleep over it then, and I don't lose sleep over what I did back then. But I'll tell you, I know more now, and I know how to do it better now. And I know now that in today's ABA, if that kid is crying, we let him go. It means we're pushing too much too soon, that the colors don't matter. That my job is ultimately to make sure he wants to learn from adults. And I don't want to strain those kind of relationships going forward. So in today's ABA, or compassionate version of ABA, if that kid's crying, I'm going to say, hey, take a break. And then I'm going to reconstitute my teaching plan. And the onus is on me to devise a better teaching plan for him to come back. Now, listen, there are remnants of this historically in ABA all the time. I got to work with this guy named Don Bushell at the University of Kansas. And my close colleague, Tony Camilleri, was directly supervised by Don Bushell. Don Bushell did century schools. Don Bushell was responsible for one of the independent variables in Project Follow-Through, the largest national study of how to teach reading, writing, and arithmetic. And he showed that the ABA method was superior to 7 other methods, along with Engelman's direct instruction model. He ran an amazing set of schools where kids basically elected to participate in all their academics. There was no escape extinction going on. These guys weren't crying in academics, and they all were learning 2 or 3 grades better than same age peers. So I had the luxury of seeing, before it was named that way, an assent-based model, a way to design reinforcing environments so people vote with their feet and elect to participate and do hard things to then earn contextually relevant reinforcers, which is, I'm describing basically what happened at Century School in words they maybe didn't use, but if we looked at it now, we would. So let me go back to it. I believe ABA should be compassionate. It should lead with concern. Okay, period. And that is a commitment. And I'm not saying, and I am saying, I guess, Matt, I would never do an ABA that lacks compassion.
Sure.
Okay. Now let's talk about trauma assumed for a minute. we wrote a paper a couple of years ago, my colleagues and I. I'm the last author on it. Raja Rahman is the first author on it. But basically, it was trauma-informed ABA. Now, trauma-informed ABA is the future, but it's not happening right now. Trauma-informed ABA, and it's not for every kid. It's for kids who have severe behavior. That's what that paper's written for. The assumption is this. If a kid's willing to punch their face, punch you, or flip a table with an ordinary ask to do math or something, it's likely that they have experienced a series of adverse events that have resulted in such an extraordinary response to a simple ask. And maybe we should do some assessments to figure out what those adverse events are and learn this with such specificity that we promise not to re-traumatize the kid in the name of teaching, right? That's trauma-informed ABA. But the other part of trauma-informed ABA is to reintroduce those situations, those mundane situations for others that are traumatic for some, and make sure that kids can behave effectively in those situations. Trauma-informed ABA is hard. Trauma-informed ABA requires a skill set most BCBAs don't have. Trauma-informed ABA, though, is also unnecessary for most learners. I worry about trauma-informed ABA because when people do trauma assessments, they are losing relationships with families before they even had one. Trauma-informed ABA is hard, and I'm not sure about it.
Can you say more about that last statement there?
Yeah, I think people have to be careful assuming trauma and talking about traumatic histories with families. It can be quite off-putting, if not downright offensive, and you can lose relationships with families when not done properly. Just to say, well, they're engaging in SIB, you must have traumatized them. For instance, If you teach the parent that you're implying that, that's trouble. So for a host of reasons, including the risk of trauma assessments when not done properly, I like this idea of trauma-assumed ABA. And I will say, Matt, that I think all ABA for kids with severe behavior should be trauma-assumed. And I am saying that. I'm saying that in an extreme way. And so here's what I mean by that. What I mean is trauma-assumed. It doesn't mean you do an assessment of the adverse events. You just assume that if they're engaging in extraordinary behavior to an ordinary ask, that they probably have experienced adverse events. Do the interview, figure out what the events are. We call those establishing operations, right? We call those the situations that evoke problem behavior. There's nothing new with that. What it means, though, is as you reintroduce those situations that have historically evoked severe problem behavior, you do so in a manner that is thoughtful, gradual, progressive, and you make sure your therapy, your ABA, is highly responsive and never escalates a kid, never pushes them into the emotional borderland in the name of therapy. That's trauma-assumed ABA. It's just limiting the toolbox. And the irony, Matt, is now that I do this, my team does this, we teach others to do this, we're way more effective assessing and treating severe behavior than we ever were. So I think people worry about trauma assumed. They worry about this idea of limiting their toolbox, that they're going to be less effective. But the irony is that we're more effective when we take a slower, more humane approach to these same problems. Let me say it a different way. I had the opportunity to work with this country that's just setting up special ed. They're arguably 50 years behind, North America in how they serve kids with intellectual disabilities. And there was this young lady, and her bones were curved in a very unique way. And I saw videos of her, and my understanding was it must have been a genetic sort of anomaly that I was unaware of. But I learned through the open-ended interview that their team did, but this young lady was restrained holding a bunch of stuffed animals and tied up every time she engaged in aggression and SIB for so many years and for so long that you could see it in her bones. And if you can see it in the bones, I'm pretty sure there's some trauma history there. And my point here is I want people to think about that girl every time they do ABA. And I want you to think, with that girl, would you do hand-over-hand guidance with her for colors if she was crying? For that girl, would you ignore her pleas to stop? For that girl, would you use timeout, seclusion? No, you wouldn't. So trauma-assumed ABA takes those kind of histories and kind of applies them to kids who clearly don't have such extraordinary trauma histories, but makes us behave in a way that we don't run the risk of re-traumatizing kids when they have that unknown trauma. And that's the beauty to me of this trauma-assumed ABA. It just kind of puts the onus on us to do it better, to do ABA better, to be more responsive and more careful in the name of therapy. The problem is when people hear me talk about things like that, they feel bad. They feel bad about their version of ABA, and they feel bad maybe about what they did in the past and what they're teaching and whatnot. I'm not asking people to just feel bad about it. I don't, like I said in the beginning, I'm not losing sleep over what I did in the past. If I know better, I'm trying to do better, okay? And that's what we're doing as a field here. But what I want people to recognize is that in the past, some of our procedures were a little too assertive, a little too draconian, a little too Machiavellian, pick the word you like best. And nowadays, we're simply going to be more responsive to the learner, and we can get as good, if not better, outcomes when we are doing that. And it does involve limiting your toolbox a little bit. Now, I'm going to circle back to the other thing you said. Is it happening on social media that people are limiting their toolbox in extreme ways? Are people also saying a lot of polemic things about never using extinction and I will never do that and always do that? Yes, that's happening. But I see that more as an issue of social media representation of evidence-based practice. What I ask people to do is to read the journal articles. Do not run away. I've been saying this for a long time now. Don't run away from the journal articles. Again, I love the people who are posting stuff on social media. They're pushing kind of some ideas, and I think that's healthy, and it's not going anywhere, so it doesn't really matter what I think. It's going to happen. But I don't want people to get confused if they're new to this with the social media depiction of trauma-assumed ABA from the actual implementation of trauma-assumed ABA and the description of it. Read the article by Dr. Rajaraman on trauma-informed ABA. Read the articles by that Tony Camilleri, it's about to come out on compassionate ABA. Read the article by Holly Gover on how to assess and treat food selectivity in an assent model. Read the article by Dr. Rajaraman and the Staubitzes on the enhanced choice model. That's all what we're talking about. These aren't just like memes. They're technological processes to make sure we don't push kids in the emotional borderlands in the name of ABA.
So I think I have read all those articles, and I think the thing that those articles have, it sounds like you described like a two-step process. One is we don't represent the we be mindful of those experiences that could inadvertently agitate or upset or accelerate the individual. But the second part is that there's a plan for the gradual overcoming of those obstacles. And I think that's the part that perhaps someone with a critical eye, maybe an old timer, if you will, when you're looking at some of these things like, oh, this is just avoiding. But it's that second part. That's the second part. I think that you described in that very thoughtful response that I wonder sometimes doesn't get the attention that it deserves.
You're totally right.
There's a lot of emphasis on making sure that people aren't re-traumatized, and that emphasis is obviously appropriate. And on top of that, what I heard from that response is the part two of that, which is the very long and challenging work of the skills-based treatment to be able to eat a wider variety of foods, or be able to go into your music class that you haven't been to all year long because you've thrown chairs every time that someone writes notes on the board or something like that, or fill in the blank of what the issue is.
You're totally right, and I think you're right that's why people are taking umbrage, perhaps, with these hyphenated ABAs, because to me, it does seem eerily similar. In my history, I remember there was an article by a guy named Steve Holborn, and he published an article in the Behavior Analyst on person-centered planning. And I remember being so upset by it. I was in grad school. I was so upset by it. Why am I sad? I did person-centered planning as a group home manager years before, but it seemed like he was advocating for something that wasn't already happening. And I'm like, this stuff is happening, is it not? And I think people are saying that with the hyphenated ABAs. Then PBS comes along. And I remember, too, not gravitating towards it initially. And I thought PBS largely was too avoidance-based. I would see the articles in Java on, they don't like doing math with paper and pencil, but they're good on a computer. And look how we eliminated problem behavior with computer-aided math instruction. I'm like, you're avoiding the problem. That is not treatment. That is avoidance. To take out the antecedent only, we call that mollification nowadays. Okay. And I can see how some people think that these hyphenated ABAs are that, because what gets advertised is the nice front end. And what is not articulated as well is the hard work of reintroducing it. To me, though, there's a great description of this by an article Lauren Bullier is the lead author on. Mm-hmm. And it's basically, it's just teaching kids to respond to their name. Not kids with autism, but kids in a busy preschool classroom or small group instruction, because it increases the odds of them cooperating with instruction that follows their name. And in that, she describes the fundamental difference, I think better than anyone I've ever seen, the fundamental difference between avoidance-based programming and prevention-based programming. Prevention is acknowledging the troublesome situation and teaching them to be effective in those situations. Prevention is teaching skills. Avoidance is removing the antecedent, what we used to call that proactive intervention, antecedent-only intervention. And I believe that stuff is just a baby step in any therapy. But that's what it is in PFA, right? What do we do at the very beginning? We remove all evocative events through the non-contingent provision of all suspected reinforcers. The antecedent only, this proactive stuff, is a great first step. Prove it. Prove that you can get zero problem behavior by removing the antecedents. You must know something about the antecedents if you achieve that. But my word, if you stop there, if all you did was brought the joy, if all you did was provide reinforcers non-contingently, those kids would be developmentally delayed for the rest of their careers. The hard part is not that. That's 5 minutes. The hard part is skill-based treatment, progressively reintroducing them based on their performance and shucking and jiving based on their performance and getting out to those finish lines. And that's hard work.
We've talked about assent a number of times already. And I don't know if there's more to say on that, but it is along with these other topics that we just finished discussing, trauma and compassion, etc. It is something that's generating a lot of discussion in ABA circles. What, from your mind, and again, I don't know why I'm obsessed with this whole concept of boundary conditions.
Because you think like a scientist, maybe?
I don't know. I appreciate that. I can. There are many times, and I just think to my own, work interactions I've had with my own kids, where changing a diaper with a fussy baby. My kids are older now, so that's way far in the rearview mirror. Not a lot of assent involved, when someone's kicking and flailing and whatnot. Putting a kid in a car seat that doesn't want to get in the car seat. Not a lot of assent involved.
Right.
But even telling my 16-year-old to get the hell off PlayStation, I don't care about assent under those circumstances.
Of course.
I want him to finish his homework and get a decent night's sleep. And, I can be nice about saying it, but it's a firm boundary that I'm drawing. And I'm not concerned about whether he agrees with my point of view on that or sees the long-term benefit of a good night's sleep versus staying up to play Madden with his friends, whose parents perhaps don't care about their sleep habits, etc. That's a whole other conversation. But anyway, you get the idea here. So there are, at least from my own parenting perspective, I have boundary conditions for assent, where there are times where I want cooperation. There are times where it's like, this just has to happen and things like that.
Right on. Matt,
do those principles translate into practice, given all the, this discussion of assent this and assent that in our field?
Yeah, let's try to unpack it. Assent is complicated when we think about it generally, especially as parents and especially as coaches and behavior analysts, to the myriad of problems behavior analysts work with. It's not complicated to me when we're dealing, though, with kids with severe behavior these days. And so I think that's a good place to start. And people are obviously generalizing the concept out from beyond that, but that's where we started talking about it. So let's just talk about that for a minute. I like the concept of assent with kids with severe behavior primarily because it decreases the odds of escalation in that therapeutic context. So it started for us with this concept of leave the door open. We used to call it, Matt, open. We didn't call it assent-based. We called it open door door therapy.
I remember that, yeah.
Yeah, just leave the door open. And we would just tell kids, especially with kids with language, but even kids without language, we would just say, we're going to practice. If you don't want to do okay. Now with little kids, sometimes their mommy was in the waiting room, so they could just run down the hallway to their parents if they weren't involved in the session. For older learners, they would just say, I want to go home. So be it. Now, why did we do that? We did that for this one client, and let's call him Jeffrey. We did this with this one client, Jeffrey, who did not have autism. He had generalized anxiety disorder, ADHD, oppositional defiant disorder. He was language able, pretty smart guy, not great with reading comprehension work, needed some tool skills there, but super good at math and other things, played games well, all that. The analysis, he tried to leave the room. This is before we did open door stuff. And we had this policy, like we did 5-minute sessions. So you got to go leave the room and visit your parents or go to the bathroom every 5 minutes. That's 12 times in an hour. That's more than most Catholic school students get to go to the bathroom in a year. We gave 12 an hour. So I thought that was pretty defensible. Yeah. But this guy tried to leave the room. We're like, yeah, no, you got some minutes left. And, he had a big old meltdown, and he could engage in problem behavior pretty effectively, if you will. And it was painfully obvious to me that we could not serve those kind of kids with that door closed, that we had to let him go because we wanted to expand our scope of competence to larger, older, language-able kids off the spectrum without intellectual disabilities. And this closed door was a real problem. And so that started the conversation of leave the door open and let them leave. Then that initiated the next conversation was, how do we make sure they never want to leave our therapy? Do you know what I mean? How do we do this in a way that they like it? I know it seems like a simple thing, but we never asked ourselves that question. Do they love our therapy? Do they like it even? Now, we did a bunch of studies in the past, and, those concurrent chain studies. Do you want this treatment or that treatment? So we had a little bit of history in this, and we learned a little bit about the things Kids University like contingent reinforcement, things like that, unpredictable schedules, etc. So we had those factors built into the therapy, thank goodness. But we would really work hard. It made us as a team work harder to make sure that student wanted to be in session. Now, as we reflect on the literature and our practice right now, there are 3 things that are kind of predictive of getting assent. Number 1, start with the give, not the ask. Old ABA is the ask, right? Remember the old Lobos, wait, when you sit in the chair, then you get an M&M. That's starting with the ask. And there's a lot of crying in those early ABA videos, right? Before the kid with autism finally sits in the damn chair, and then there's happy, and we're off to the races. Mm-hmm. This is the opposite. We don't start with the ask, we start with the give. We provide all the reinforcements. If you want to get assent, yeah, we're part of it. We're designing the environment, okay? And so, yes, we provide all the reinforcers, and that's how we make sure they want to come back. Second, you got to empower the learner. Now, this is just doing functional analysis, but empowerment basically means you have to wildly disappoint them. Again, we're going to do it progressively, gently. We're going to use some conditioned EOs. We're going to stand. We're going to give a soft clap. We're going to get close. And we're going to ask them to stop whatever they're doing that's fun. Come over here and do something that's wicked hard. That's a progressing the EO in a general sense. We're going to watch them for any sign of problem behavior, and we're going to honor it. If you want kids to assent to therapy, this empowerment thing, and I know I'm not using behavior analytics speak, but it's okay. I want them to know their behavior operates effectively in that environment. And we know from years of research that contingent reinforcement is a highly preferred context. We know that from dogs and monkeys and pigeons and rats and kids with autism and kids with autism. Contingent reinforcement is a preferred context. So you better set up a simple contingency at first and make sure they are effectively operating in that environment. That's
Unless
what
you're
we
a
do.
cat, as Holly informed
Oh
me.
my God. I freaking love that. Now we know as behavioral scientists, we just need to come up with a better operandum for the cat. But I love the idea that they're just like, meow, meow, just give me the food, working for shit. But anyways, so second step, simple contingency, empowerment, make sure whatever their baseline response is. Again, we're not teaching it first. We're just accepting. So that's the other part of this process. It's give them it starts with a give. Then the next step is acceptance. I'm going to disappoint you. Whatever response you give me, I'm going to accept. If it's delightful, I'm going to reinforce that. If it's a precursor, I'm going to reinforce that. If it's a severe behavior, I'm going to reinforce that. I'm baselining you. Apparently, that's what's at strength in your repertoire. I accept it. So once we do that and we empower the kid, we teach them they're operating effectively, then we stretch, we shape, we chain, and we teach those skills. Because there's no delay in this therapy, Matt, that's the other thing we're trying to teach people conceptually. People are like, oh, that's delay training, right? I don't call it that because I don't believe there's any delay in SBT. We're just stretching the response unit. It used to be small, and then it's 2 behaviors, then 3 behaviors, then 20 behaviors, then 30 behaviors. There's no delay. There's just an immediate reinforcer to a longer response chain. I think that's the other part to get kids to assent to therapy is that you're strengthening repertoires through chaining and you're using powerful reinforcers to maintain them. And then that intermittent unpredictable reinforcement schedule is also reinforcing. So I have a lot more to say about assent, but I'm trying to bring it back to when we're talking about assent, we're talking about open door therapy, which has made us more honest in our approach to make it a more pleasant experience and an experience with less problem behavior, which is safer for the student and the implementer. It allows us to expand our scope of competence and do ABA in places we didn't do it before, right? These kids, we only did this on severe behavior units. We don't do it anymore. We do it in the home. We do it in church school. We're trying to keep kids in school by doing these processes. So you need to know how to keep the door open, but make sure that child wants to stay with you in that therapy so they can, develop. And that's really where the assent stuff came from, at least in my little corner of the world. Now, people are extending it out, like you're saying, on social media. And they're extending it out. But again, I think social media is not the right portrayal of it. There are obviously conditions under which we're going to say, yeah, we're going to have to not honor your assent. But I tell you, Matt, when people give me their examples, your examples with parenting, we'll do that last. But when people give me examples as a behavior therapist, I still say to them, or at least to myself, you could do an assent model there. Oh, they don't like haircuts and all that, so we're going to do descents. And if they cry, we're just going to expose them to it and force them through it. I think that's rubbish. I think you have to be better as a behavior analyst. If you're trying to teach a kid to do the haircut, first of all, desensitization is that's not a behavioral technique. Okay, that's a cognitive behavioral therapy technique that's poorly understood by us. Desensitization really just means expose them to the aversive event over and over again until they get over it. It's respondent, then operant extinction. We need to be better than just doing respondent and operant extinction. If you want the kid to be effective taking a haircut, you need to teach them the behaviors, the contextually appropriate behaviors of getting in a haircut, which is sitting in a seat and donning the apron, and maybe we have to put some reinforcers in. They watch a movie. Every time they twitch, the movie stops and all that. It's called differential reinforcement. That's the ABA I want to see. I don't want people claiming anymore, well, kid needs a haircut, so he might cry a little bit. Just because we can doesn't mean we should. I like to teach my group, I want you to pretend that little kid that you can make get a haircut, you can make cut their nails, you can make get a blood draw, you can make whatever, the list goes on. I want you to pretend that they were 300 pounds. They were way stronger than everybody in the room, and they were really artful with their protest and aggressive behavior. And I want you to treat that 3-year-old that way. I want you to see if you can do this with that imagined kind of client, because we can. All it takes is a little bit more patience. All it takes is a little bit more thought. Like with these kids in dentistry, a lot of good behavior analysts know how to do this stuff. They slow roll it a little bit. They give the kid an escape response. Good dentists do that. Every time the kid raises your hand, you take a little break. You get escape to nothing for raising your hand. You get escape to a movie and trinkets or whatever if you engage in the contextually appropriate behavior, which is keeping your mouth open while your tooth gets drilled. It's a differential reinforcement, but it's safe It's whatever we want to call it, assent-based, right? They raise their hand, you honor each and every time. So I don't struggle with assent-based procedures as much as I'm seeing other people. I'm seeing some pushback on social media. I'm seeing some abstracts for conferences and whatnot. And I'm seeing examples like your own with parenting, and those are reasonable. But when we are being professionals and we are doing behavior analysis and getting paid for it, I believe we need to do it better. And letting the kid cry and forcing them to be subjugated to these procedures that they clearly don't understand are important to them is not something that I think we should be doing as a field, because we can do better. We know how to do better. That's it. As far as parenting, parent how you want to parent. I've stopped giving parenting advice, you know what I mean? To be honest, you know what I mean? There's laissez-faire parenting. There's letting your kids be like free-range chickens. There's more controlling parenting. You know, it's above my pay grade at this point. I know how to work with kids with problem behavior, sleep problems, feeding problems, disruptive, and all that. And with all those kids, I'm trying to do assent-based therapy because it decreases escalation. It makes me better at managing the contingency. And I know I can get to finish lines despite the gentle start.
Got it. Do you have time for a few more listener? I got some listener questions from the Patreon group and a few other friends of the show. So
of course, let's do it.
All right. Very cool. I want to just issue a blanket appreciation to everyone who took the time to write in some questions here. So let's start with Natalie from Long Island. She asks, I'm very interested in your PFA and would like to attend your training program. Does PFA replace traditional FBAs? If so, how does it satisfy the New York State Education Department's criteria for conducting an FBA? So I don't know if I'm not going to hold you to the chapter and verse of the New York regs. But
thank you.
More generally, I don't think people in New York want to be, that's a different conversation. But more generally, how would you respond to that? To that?
Yeah. If she didn't bring up the New York State Department criteria, I would just say, yes, PFA replaces an FBA in my world, for sure. However, given that there's some regulatory language in the question, I would just say that PFA is an FBA. Not it replaces it, it is an FBA. So, you have your guidelines for what to do with a functional behavioral assessment. You're going to work within those guidelines, but a PFA satisfies the guidelines of a functional assessment. Again, the main difference is when we're done, we just are humble enough to admit that we don't know the function of any particular behavior. And in an FBA, people have not been humble in the past as we've checked boxes of attention and escape, but not tangibles, even though we can't do that. Okay? As science, we cannot rule out a function because we did not show sensitivity of it, especially in a descriptive assessment, a correlational assessment, but even in a functional analysis. So all I say to these kind of questions is, do a PFA, write it within the confines of the FBA, put it another way, check every function box before you even do it. Yes, it's attention, it's escape, attention, tangibles, and sensory, and then draw lines next to the boxes and put in the qualitative details. What were they escaping from? What kind of attention? Which tangibles? And what were the sensory reinforcers? And that's it. Okay, get qualitative detail in there. You're still working within the regulatory confines of the New York State FBA, but the PFA can work within that.
All right. Natalie, thanks so much. Rose Griffin, Rose, former guest on the show, ABA Speech. She said, have you presented your work for speech therapists? And if so, how have they received it? Thanks, Rose.
Yeah, sure. It's funny. I've never been to an SLP conference per se. I've never had a room of just SLPs, if you will, in the space. However, whenever we do these live trainings, there's always SLPs in the room. We've had hundreds of SLPs take our on-demand courses. Historically, SLPs had a little trouble with this thing called the omnibus mans. They struggle a little bit with this notion of one response yielding all reinforcers for a child that they just taught real mans to, if you will, specific mans, pure mans, whatever you want to call them. But we've come to a total agreement on that. in a sense, that if we have 2 minutes of conversation, we say, listen, this is just the first response to eliminate severe behavior. We will be working on specific mans if they don't come back online naturally. That's probably my only rub historically with SLPs. Let me say it a different way, Rose. When the SLPs are in the room, they like what we're teaching usually more readily than behavior analysts. The SLPs are digging it. The OTs are digging it. The special ed teachers are digging it. It's the BCBAs that having a little bit more, as others would say, cognitive dissonance with the process, and they have to process it, if you will, maybe get some redundancies. And what I tell to the BCBAs or even a reluctant SLP is, don't change your practice. I'm sure you're pretty damn good at your practice. Do this with one client. Try it on for size with one client. And those are the SLPs that have done that. They tried it on for size with one new client. They brought the joy. They empowered the learner. They let them play with all the speech language therapy toys and whatnot. And then they slowly work towards their SLP goals. That's the process, and it's resonating with them. My colleague, Corey Whalen, is a BCBA SLP, and I know he has spoken direct with SLP groups, and so he's someone maybe to reach out to, but our goal is to get this in the hands of more SLPs in the future for sure.
Emily Beal Wilkinson from the Victory Academy in Portland, Oregon asks, hi, Dr. Hanley, have you or your team experimented with extending the toleration response to a full response class of tolerating, which in parentheses, deep breathing, calming phrase, etc., for events that are necessary but may never be preferable or reinforcing, like medical or dental procedures, like we just talked about?
Yeah. Well, I know a little secret that most listeners don't know, and that is that Emily Beal Wilkinson actually is super effective at this. And she has showed some data already very recently of using SBT and kind of extending these behavior chains into these medical compliance sort of areas. And so, but I know the question is in earnest, like, are we doing anything as researchers to kind of push this and make this more technological? And I'll tell you, Emily, we are not yet. But because of conversations like I've had with you and others, this is clearly a good area to go. I still struggle when people are just doing desensitization. Okay, that is not good enough these days. That is too old a procedure, too barren a procedure. Okay, what we're trying to do with these procedures is ask the question always, what is the learner expected to do? Even in MRI, there's doing. If you've had an MRI, you're not behaving. You're behaving. It's hard to stay still. That's behavior. And so the point is making sure we're always figuring out what is the contextually appropriate behavior under the conditions of the aversive event. And we're changing two things at a time: the amount of contextually appropriate behavior expected and the strength of the aversive event. And those two things are changing as we're getting to the terminal goal of adherence to the medical procedure. We're doing this in our clinical and our consultation work a fair amount. It's a branch in SPT, but we have no research on it. So I hope someday you publish something on it, or we get off our duffs and do something with it. But to me, SPT and all the things we used to desense kids to is a perfect marriage, because it gets people, again, to focus on the behavior you're expecting so you can use differential reinforcement appropriately, not just do extinction-based programming.
Right. Sarah DeGoya from Virginia asks, do you have a quote-unquote mic drop behavior, i.e. one type of behavior that when it occurs, you just want to walk out the door, walk away from? And if so, what is it? That's a fun question, Sarah.
That is a super fun question. That is really fun. As I think about it, I guess I don't, because I've never walked away. And I've had some, I'm not going to get into war stories, but I've seen a fair amount of interesting behaviors. I don't think I have one, but in hindsight, I will tell you, this is a war story, but I will tell you one of the grossest thing that's happened to me. I think it's appropriate. It still is respectful to the client. It was a client that was an older woman in an institution, and, there was no IQ test or anything and all that. And she didn't have a lot of skills, apparently, or what I was told. And I was doing a simplistic preference assessment, but she was a rambler. So we had to kind of circle the room as she played with whatever thing I put in her hand. And I saw this young lady kind of look at me with a knowing look, and I thought it was curious. She made interesting eye contact, which was rare for her. She had a fan, one of those personal fans in her hand, and she angled it like she knew something about vector analysis, and she vomited in the fan and shot it right into my mouth. And I thought, like it was genius. It was so genius. She was very bright. So I learned that after that. But I would say that was the one that I should have walked out of the room, but the resources did not allow.
Yes, that's a story for sure. I think anyone who's done any type of residential work knows about keeping spare clothes in the trunk of your car and things like
always.
that. Just
toothbrush.
Yeah. Oh yeah. So, all right. So people, the listeners weren't able to see me wince in the description of that story, but that sounds pretty gross. But
sorry if you're eating.
But you're still here, so that
there you go.
It's like that guy says, "Did you die?" All right. My colleague Jen Ferris from Sprout and Monadic Behavioral Consulting, she asks how do you mitigate the rigid application and potential misapplication of these protocols, especially given the number of trainees that continue to rapidly increase and as well as opportunities for direct supervision that may be limited?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, this is anytime you write it down or say it, it becomes rigid. It's hard to teach flexibility, and to do something flexible, you kind of got to do it rigidly at first, right? It's like learning a language. You got to, speak it rigidly and then flexibly. Same thing with a sport and playing musical instruments and all that. So the rigidity is may happen in the beginning. It may in some ways be considered a necessary first step in doing this process. That said, how do we, like you say, mitigate it or reduce the length of time people are doing it rigidly and whatnot? I'd say the first thing is get knowledge. I love that this is, I started a free website years ago. This is, like I've said in the beginning, this is open source. It's in peer-reviewed research. You can just go grab it and go do it. You don't have to do any particular training. You can do it. But if we want to mitigate the rigid application, there's a way to do it well. And the way to do it well is first get knowledge. Take a course on this, learn from experts who have done this process. This is not something that should be learned on Facebook. Yeah? This is a clinical process, and evidence-based practice requires direct training. First step in training is knowledge. Second step is supported implementation. Someone should be with you when you're doing the analysis, for instance, the first time, who's done an analysis. And the last part is an apprenticeship model, a consultative model. So you have someone to check in with as you're shaping and chaining the skills together who's done it before. So rigid application comes from reading something and trying it on for size without feedback from somebody else. That's where the rigidity is going to come. The only way you're going to get flexible is through amazing number of implementations. Man, to learn to do this through only direct experience will be rough. So we know expertise comes best through direct experience with feedback, right? With coaching with someone who's done it before to get you over those obstacles. So, it sounds basic, but it's just behavior skills training, right? It's knowledge and it's role playing and modeling and then getting feedback. And sometimes that can happen in grad school. There are a few grad schools now finally, teaching this stuff in a more deliberate manner, not just a little sample of it, but actually deliberately teaching it. But for the most part, this is a postmaster's sort of training thing. You have to go to a training, and just like the other things that are important to us, ACT and the BB map, and you got to learn to do it. You got to go someplace, get the knowledge, and then have someone shadow you or give you feedback on how to do it. There's nothing about this that is more rigid than anything else. And in fact, I think a lot of ABA is rigid. That's the problem with it. This, to me, is the last thing I think about this process is rigid. It's a wicked flexible process, which makes it a little hard to do. Like Matt was saying, you were saying in the beginning, Matt, it's like there's a fair amount of conditional discriminations. And that means it's flexible.
Okay. Jen, thanks for the question. Dave O'Regan from Galway, Ireland asks, what would you take into consideration when adapting the PFA SBT process for adults with intellectual disabilities, potentially with other additional diagnoses and or trauma histories?
Yeah, good. I know Dave. He's a great guy, Dave O'Regan. I want to go back. I didn't answer Jen's question completely, Matt. One thing, and I want to answer Dave's. She mentioned something about the opportunities for direct supervision being limited, and people worry about cost. I understand that. And so I just want to touch upon that topic really clear. Listen, the cost of doing this process wrong is higher than the cost to do it right. Okay, it just is. Doing this process with kids with severe problem behavior or any process wrong or incompletely so you don't actually solve the problem is very costly. If you know the math of residential placement, this is costly. So I just ask that you advocate for proper training and get it. And it can be done. There are training grants out there. And when people come to our company and they say, we can't afford this, we figure it out. Okay, so training is costly. It's a smidgen of the cost that it took to become a behavior analyst, or probably even an RBT these days. But nevertheless, I want you to consider the flip side. The flip side is the cost of being an ineffective behavior analyst with severe problem behavior. And those costs are too high these days. So remember the flip side. But back to Dave's question. You know what? I know Dave works with adults with disabilities in Ireland and works with adults with trauma histories in Ireland. And I want to give a more thoughtful response to this, but I'll be honest, Matt, we're trying to make this process generally applicable. Like I was saying, we want people to imagine they're always working with someone with a trauma history who can really hurt them. You know what I mean? Like, pretend you're doing this with a grown person who's a highly effective at severe behavior, and they have a real tremendous trauma history. Pretend like that is always the case. So when people say, how do you do this with this kind of extreme population? I'm like, we just do the process. The process is built to be amazingly risk averse. In other words, don't put an EO until you get HRE. When you put in that first EO, accept the first response. That's all risk-averse stuff. It's built for safety, okay? So to Dave's question, there's really no other differences other than perhaps, in getting back to the weeds, when you pick the branches for these learners, you make sure that if they can speak, that they have a voice, that what we're working on in their branches is dictated a little bit about the things that are valuable to them. Or you're listening to team members that are professionally responsible for the habilitative plan, and make sure that what we're teaching them when we have that opportunity in skill-based treatment is not, unfortunate. I know when I worked in group homes, I got there and they wanted me to help guys clean the toilets and dust the tables and all that. And thank goodness I had a great psychologist work with me, and she taught me how to write goals for kids to climb Mount Monadnock and pack a bag and pack a lunch and learn how to be responsive to trail markers and whatnot. So again, with the adults, it's probably more important that we really honor the functional skills and the values if the person or the family can articulate them.
All right. I got a question from a longtime listener, Reggie Ponio. Reggie asks, I want to ask Dr. Hanley if he had any tips for working with a learner that has shown resistance when being prompted to use the omnibus man by ignoring or walking away. I think that contextually, this learner has a history of avoiding when teaching trials are presented, and prompts to use the omnibus man may be similar to previous teaching trials that he's learned to avoid. So when you prompt someone to say my way and they just peace out, so.
Right on. Reggie, that's a great question. And a lot of times this treatment gets gummed up at the transition from the analysis to FCT, right? That's where is a sticking point, and it's real. And we've spent a lot of time trying to make sure that's not a sticking point. So I'm going to give you a couple tips. If you were to do this again, maybe not with this learner you're asking me about, but in general, the first thing we emphasize a lot now is show the contingency to the learner before you expect them to participate in the contingency. Said another way, we don't prompt. We don't use instructional prompts at first, especially for kids that have ODD or anything like that in their folder, okay, in their naming system people using. What I mean by showing the contingency is, that's just pretty simple about it. There's a big red Big Mac, a button on the table, and we'll get to why that might even be there with someone with decent language. I'm going to put in the EO. I'm going to, go to disappoint them. Right before I saw problem behavior in the analysis, I know when it's about to occur because I saw it in the analysis. Right before that point in the progression, I'm going to press the red button that says my way, and then I'm going to sit down and reinforce. I expect nothing from the learner. I show them the contingency. I might do that on 5 trials. The sixth trial, I'm still not going to prompt them to press the button. I'm going to progress the EO deeper. You see what I'm saying? I'm going to get it under motivative control. The problem is we're too prompty. We love prompts because they're so expedient, but they get us in trouble with a lot of learners. Our mission with the transition from problem behavior yielding reinforcement in the analysis to communication yielding reinforcement and treatment is to get it done via modeling, usually, or showing the contingency, not through prompting, especially instructional prompts. Second, we rely on what we call open contingency classes now with functional communication training. Even if they have language, I'm going to reinforce if they say my way. I'm going to reinforce if they put their thumb to their chest. I'm going to reinforce if they hand me a sentence strip or they press a big red button. I'm going to have multiple response opportunities out there, and I'm going to model multiple ones. And then when I progress the EO deeper, I'm going to accept any of them. It's called an open contingency class. The days of an a priori decision about what their communication responses are going to be are behind us. We have multiple responses at hand so we don't get caught in that trap. The last thing is the kid walking away. We would work with you, Reggie, on making sure you knew how to progress the EO. In other words, keep dialing up the heat. The man lives in the EO. You need to make sure the EO continues. And so this whole notion of walk away, we want to make sure that we can keep the heat on, if you will. And so we would keep progressing the EO in that situation. And again, I would need more details for any particular learner, but I hope the point is clear. Show contingencies before you prompt participation in them. A. B. Rely on multiple responses as you transition into communication training. And C. Make sure you have a clear path for how to motivate that learner to respond. In other words, you might as well just hit the damn red button and go back to the amazing synthesized reinforcement condition. We need to make sure that stuff's in place. If you have that in place, this stuff shouldn't be a problem. But I agree, Reggie, it has been a sticking point in the past. That's why we did studies to try to address it.
All right. Katie Ellman from Pinellas County Schools, and she is a self-described one of the scooter ladies. Apparently, you might know what that means. It's perhaps an inside joke. But
I saw them at a conference. Yes, they're great. It's a great group at Pinellas County Schools.
Yes, yeah, they are. They are indeed.
I know you know them.
She said, if you could select 1 to 2 critical elements that would increase the likelihood of successful PFA SBT implementation in public schools, what would they be and why?
This is a good question, Matt.
My listeners, they came to the table for sure.
This is gonna. I'm like a broken record, Matt, but I'll tell you, if you want to increase successful implementation in schools, you got to get the proper training, which Pinellas County Schools is doing. Proper training is knowledge, supported implementation, and consultation. Okay, so there's a lot of people trying this on for size for schools, struggling with it, and maybe walking away from it. But again, if you want to increase the odds of success, the moderator of success is knowing how to do it well. And knowing how to do anything well requires, again, knowledge and supported application with feedback. The second thing is, and this is strategic on purpose, it's selecting the right students to start with. We used to be too prideful with that. We're like, yeah, the toughest kid, the kid that's about to be out of district and all that. But that was more, it was like prideful. It was silly. What you want to do is you really want to think about which child would benefit the most, which would have the most developmental growth in the shortest amount of time. So it's reinforcing to you, the implementer. Make sure you pick a client that people who are in charge of decisions in your school district will pay attention to that behavior change. They have to be on someone's radar. Do you know what I mean? They don't have to be the toughest kid in Pinellas County, but they have to be someone that we're struggling with. We're not meeting their educational needs. And so it would be important to do so. So those are really the two. If you have to limit it to 2, it's make sure you have the knowledge and support to do this well. And then second, start out with the client that's going to be reinforcing for you to implement it with. And once you have a single success story on your turf with your personnel, that's when the shift begins to happen. I can show 100 videos, it doesn't matter. When you do it in Pinellas County and you get one success story and a parent gets socially validating that outcome and an educational tech validating that outcome, that's when the shift can happen. That's when you can start to scale it.
All right. Last question. Will Greg Hanley get back on the mountain bike this summer?
Matt, That is a good question. I will tell the audience, if they don't know this already from a different podcast, that Matt is a self-proclaimed not an athletic guy. He said that to me once. He says, I'm not much of an athletic guy. And then I went mountain biking with him, and Matt is probably the best mountain biker I ever mountain biked.
Come on.
It's true, man. You're so good at mountain biking. I had such a blast. I'll tell the listeners, I was on an mountain bike. Matt was on a regular mountain bike, and I still was hustling just to keep up with him. So that said, Matt, I had a little motorcycle accident not so long ago, and that kept me off a mountain bike, but I've still been biking around the town, and I'm good to go. So now that the weather's breaking a little bit and it's a little less gross out in New England, I want to get back to it. So know that I'm ready.
All right. Well, this has been a marathon session. We've kept you way, way, way over the time you allotted. I appreciate every minute of it. There's been a lot of, I think, a lot of nuance, a lot of clarification. I think the audience is really going to benefit from this, Greg. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Matt. Thanks for the chance. Always appreciate it. See you.
Thank you for listening to the Behavioral Observations Podcast with Matt Sikoria. You can find Matt's notes on this episode at www.behavioralobservations.com. We also invite you to stay connected with us on Facebook at facebook.com/behavioral observations and on Twitter at Behavior Podcast.